My name is Stephen Ferry. I'm a nonfiction photographer. I've worked with the press, with newspapers and magazines for many years. And I also worked for over 12 years to produce this book, which is called Violentology, a manual of the Colombian conflict. I think part of it, and even the aesthetics of the cover, which is a picture from the Violentólogos, and it sort of forms part of the Memoria Histórica. It's part of the group of pictures that, it was Gonzalo Sanchez, who's now running the National Commission on Historical Memory, who collected these pictures of the bandoleros políticos. So, this is the period of time out of which the FARC emerged, because Marolando was one of the liberal guerrillas who refused to accept the amnesties and remained in El Monte. So, in some ways, for me, the book, I'm very happy that it's being used in Medellin and in the National Commission. There's a law now that it has to be, the conflict has to be studied in schools. So in a sense, it becomes a history book and not so much a reportage in a matter of 5 years. So I just wanted to keep the focus on human rights as kind of a constant. And in fact, I did a lot of the work working with Human Rights Watch. I work with that organization because their investigators are so good. And it's not like they never make things up just because they want donors. They really look at things carefully. So I look, at the human rights violations of all the groups. The FARC, with its practice of kidnapping particularly, receives quite a lot of attention. But I also talk about their indiscriminate use of car bombs and other characteristics, other abuses committed by the guerrilla. The paramilitary's signature crime is forced disappearance and often the dismemberment of people. And the whole scandal of false positives in which the army murdered, looks like well over 3,000 of their own citizens, dressed them up as guerrillas and presented them as battlefield victories. That was the signature crime, if you want. It's much less dangerous for me than it is for my colleagues who are Colombian, period. And that's a big factor that determines how the conflict is covered. Also, some of this work was produced on grants, and that gave me the luxury. I mean, you have to go slow. I do, at least. And, it's easy. There's a lot of things that are hard to read in the conflict, and you don't want to just show up someplace without knowing who is who and how things work, more or less. And you can't necessarily do that if you're on a newspaper rhythm. If you do know the dynamic as a Colombian photographer or a Colombian journalist, it's because you live in that place. And that means that you and your family are at risk from whatever goes into the newspaper. That's important. Photographically, probably the biggest challenge for me in pictures was to talk about the importance of the land in the kind of photographs that I'm using in this book. Because land is certainly in the center of this whole conflict going back. Even if the causes of the many wars were not necessarily land, the fighters used the opportunity, or the commanders used the opportunity to steal land from peasants while the war was going, right? And just take their land. That's hard to show because the piece of land is still there and it doesn't show all that dramatic history. And so it's a little difficult. I mean, I have this photograph of this woman named Paola Lance. The land had been taken from her by paramilitaries in 1997 during Operation Genesis. The courts had ruled that she can return to her land. And so her family's building this little house, and whatever paramilitary successor group, maybe the same people exactly as took her land or their next generation, came and they knocked down her house. This is one way I tried to talk about land. The other thing that's really hard, I think, about photographing the Colombian conflict is there's so much deception. There's a lot of theater, and there are a lot of things that happen that aren't exactly what they look like. I covered a number of the demobilization of the paramilitaries. The demobilization ceremony in Medellin was really a theater piece. And that's, been confirmed by the paramilitary commanders who organized it, and many of us journalists all together had the same perceptions. And there are many ways to demonstrate that this was a false demobilization ceremony. But photographically, how do you show that? Because they did it more or less well. They had people standing up. I saw supposed AUC combatants, paramilitary combatants in that demobilization, with weapons in their hands that they didn't know the weapon at all. They were curious. So they're looking at the pistol like, first time they've had it in their hands. So how are they going to demobilize with their gun if it's not their gun, right? But that's hard photographically, to kind of peek behind the curtain. So at this moment, this is Salvatore Mancuso, who was the military head of the Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia, the paramilitary federation at that time. He and Carlos Castaño were running the whole thing at that moment. And the United States issued an extradition order against him for drug trafficking. So he decides that he wants to try to look good in front of the American people, and he contacted the New York Times and said he'd give an interview from clandestine location. So I go there with Juan Ferrero, who's an excellent reporter, and they put on this huge show. I mean, we got there, and there was this office, and it smelled of fresh paint. It had this bookshelf full of books that looked new. There was a wooden globe on the table, and Plato's Dialogues was open. Like Mancuso had just been reading philosophy just before he showed up. And his press guy kept insisting he's an intellectual. Look at all the books. So then they served us a huge banquet, and it's served by this spectacularly good-looking young woman who's a captive, guerrilla captive, serves the food. And he's wearing a white shirt, and he's charismatic, and he's polite, and so on. So I take the picture when he excused himself, and he made a comment on an encrypted military telephone. This is the action of a military commander. But it only happened, that was the only way I could see beyond that facade, right? I mean, there's a wonderful picture in this book by Felipe Caicedo. And, the kind of role of paramilitarism in politics is a very difficult thing to illustrate photographically. Felipe's photograph is that moment when Mancuso at least saw himself as an icon. He was invited by the Colombian Congress they lifted all his arrest warrants for all these massacres and whatever. He was under, he had all kinds of arrest warrants out. They lifted all those, and he came and he gave this triumphant speech at the Congress. And he walked in and he looks like he thinks he's a Roman emperor, right? So this photographer understood that all of this is a theater piece, basically, that Mancuso has designed. And by showing it so clearly, we can understand that, because later we know what happened to him. I mean, he's a politician. He's a mass murderer, but the guy is a politically gifted person. And he's on the political stage at this moment. A lot of these commanders who committed serious atrocities, both within the guerrillas and done things that you can't imagine, are very charismatic, and they're fun to talk to. I'm from the United States, and it's not hard for me to understand how a country can have a very violent past and how that violent past can keep affecting the present. I know that ever since I grew up. I mean, we've always been, in this country has always been at war. Right or wrong, we've been at war first with somebody all along. And the internal violence is not inconsiderable. We're the world's leaders in people going nuts and killing like 30 people at a time just because. Why does that happen so often here? So looking at Colombia and thinking about a history of violence isn't for me like an exercise from somewhere else. It relates to my own experience. And of course, the United States has a role in this conflict, so it's also interesting to me in terms of a study of U.S. foreign policy. I believe that often the interpretation of this conflict as a drug war is only a reflection of U.S. priorities. You see that in the case of a number of these big paramilitary commanders who, I think it's great that they're in jail. I don't care where, it's good that they're in jail. But they're in jail in the United States for drug trafficking, not for having killed hundreds or thousands of people. And the Colombian courts themselves have ruled, the Colombian Supreme Court has said, you know, you can't extradite these folks under drug trafficking because we want to judge them here for these crimes. So sometimes the U.S. emphasis on the counter-narcotics kind of, I think it influences the way the whole conflict has been looked at. And so that's why in this book I don't talk a lot about drugs. That's for me, the most interesting story in Colombia throughout this whole thing is how communities organize and try to have some control over their own territory and what happens on it. There's a lot of examples from the indigenous people in the Sierra Nevada. Banasa are an interesting case as well, of course, but many communities have important leaders who are doing creative things. And hopefully, you know, there's not going to be a wave of repression against all those people, you know, kind of as revenge for the peace treaty. Because that could happen, because there are very violent people in the country who don't want to see this peace treaty. These are pictures taken with that film, right? So as you can see, they're really, really grainy. And it's this film, which is a very high-sensitive film, shot at 1600 or 3200 ISO, which gives a bigger grain. And then I use a developer that makes a very fine grain at the same time, which is called Rodinal. Friends of mine told me I'm off my rocker, I went too far, you know. I even have friends saying, you know, it's not journalism. I guess what he means by that is there aren't actually like dust this big in the air, so for him it's... But for one thing, it's a way to best express my emotional state while I was taking the pictures. And I think that emotional state is, even though it sounds very subjective, it's also part of reporting, because there is fear. And there is a kind of like paying attention that happens where everything gets reduced. So these pictures kind of become very elemental, and the grain gives them a, well, partly it's a reference to film noir, you know, and we understand those conventions. It feels criminalistic. So those are also strategies to kind of keep the viewer with you.